If you could commit a cold-blooded act of taking a life to save 1,000 people and jumpstart a legendary future, would you do it? Not in theory, not in a philosophy class, but if you were broke, desperate, humiliated, and convinced the world did not care whether you lived or ceased to exist. Rodion Raskolnikov answered yes. He believed he was a god among men who could transcend the laws of the ordinary without ever breaking a sweat. He was about to discover that the first person his axe would destroy was himself, and that the human mind has a terrifying defense mechanism he had not accounted for. It will do anything to punish a conscience that has been betrayed. His perfect experiment was about to become the total, bloody disintegration of his reality. Behind this dark tale lies a question that still haunts us in 2025. Is the value of a human life a matter of simple mathematics, or is there a line that, once crossed, ensures there is no coming back, no matter how good the reasons looked on paper? Raskolnikov is about to learn that the moment you step outside the circle of humanity, the world becomes a very cold and lonely place. But here's the twist. Before the first drop of blood ever hit the floor, he had already built himself a prison. A tiny, suffocating room where the only company was his own dangerous genius. He was a man who had replaced his heart with a spreadsheet, calculating the utility of homicide until the numbers stopped making sense, and the screaming in his mind began. If you have ever tried to justify a cruel choice because it added up, you are already closer to his mindset than you might like to admit. And then, one sweltering afternoon, he finally picks up the axe. In the claustrophobic heat of a Saint Petersburg summer in 1865, this destitute former student stepped out of his coffin-like room with a heavy axe hidden beneath his coat. He was not merely walking toward a horrific transgression. He was walking toward a live experiment on his own soul. How far can a human being go against his own nature before something inside breaks? The air in the city was thick with the smell of sewage, dust, and the stale rot of poverty, a physical manifestation of the fever burning in Raskolnikov's mind. For weeks, he had remained huddled in his garret, a space so small his head nearly touched the ceiling, fermenting a theory that mirrors the main character syndrome we see in 2025. He divided the human race into two categories. On one side, the ordinary, non-player characters who live in obedience. On the other, the extraordinary, men like Napoleon Bonaparte, who, he believed, possessed the inherent right to shed blood if it served a higher purpose. He wasn't just daydreaming. He was auditioning himself for that second category. The city helped him along. St. Petersburg was a city built on a swamp, a grand imperial project that seemed to be sinking back into the mire of its own despair. Raskolnikov walked through the Haymarket district, where the stench of cheap spirits and human misery was so thick you could taste it. He saw the faces of the broken and the desperate, and instead of pity, he felt a cold, intellectual disgust. He convinced himself that the only way to save these people was to become a monster who could stand above them. He believed that the world needed a savior who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, a man who could look at a human life and see only a variable in an equation, the way modern systems reduce people to statistics and data points. If the world is that cruel, he thought, then maybe the only sane response is to become cruel on purpose. Raskolnikov had persuaded himself that by ending the life of a parasitic old pawnbroker, he could use her wealth to jumpstart a career of monumental good. One offense, he thought, could be washed away by 1,000 good deeds, provided he had the iron will to remain unshaken. He believed he was the exception to every rule, but as he climbed the dark, greasy stairs to the 4th floor, his heart pounded with a rhythm that screamed a single, terrifying truth. He was not nearly as cold-blooded as he thought. He had prepared for every variable, the timing, the weapon, the getaway, but he had failed to prepare for the sheer, suffocating weight of one whose life had been taken. The door opened. The theory ended. The nightmare began. The walk to the pawnbroker's apartment had been a descent into dread. The act itself was worse. Saint Petersburg was not a glittering capital. It was a labyrinth of narrow alleys and crowded tenements painted in a sickly, jaundiced yellow, a color that seemed to match the sickness in his thoughts. When he finally reached the apartment of Alyona Ivanovna, the mechanical precision of his perfect plan dissolved into frantic, clumsy motion. The slaying was not the surgical strike of a Superman, but a messy, terrifying eruption that stained the floor and his soul alike. Then the real horror walked in. The pawnbroker's innocent, simple-minded sister, Lizaveta, entered the room and saw everything. In an instant, Raskolnikov's logic, that only a useless life would be taken, shattered. He was forced to strike her down too. The axe, which he thought was a tool for his liberation, became a permanent weight anchored to his conscience. He escaped the building by series of agonizingly tense coincidences, returning to his garret not as a triumphant conqueror of morality, but as a man shattered by his own nerves. The physical blood on his hands was nothing compared to the rot now flooding his mind, turning his extraordinary man theory into a hollow, mocking echo. He had crossed the line, but instead of finding power, he found a darkness so deep that he began to wonder if he had ever truly been alive at all. He had tried to become a god. In the silence of his room, he realized he had only managed to become a ghost, and ghosts, in Dostoevsky's world, do not drift freely. They are hunted. If you are finding this deep dive into the mind of Dostoevsky's most famous anti-hero fascinating, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss our future explorations of the world's greatest literary masterpieces. Because to understand why this book feels like a panic attack on paper, you have to meet the man who almost ceased to exist in front of a firing squad. The intellectual crisis Raskolnikov faced was a reflection of the turmoil within Fyodor Dostoevsky himself. Dostoevsky was writing in a state of absolute financial ruin, haunted by creditors and the crushing weight of gambling debts. He had even signed a predatory contract with a publisher that threatened to strip him of the rights to all his future works if he did not produce another novel simultaneously. Yet, the darkness in crime and punishment came from deeper than money. In 1849, Dostoevsky stood in Semyonov Square in the biting Russian cold, wearing a white shroud, watching soldiers level their rifles at his chest. At the final second, a messenger from the Tsar arrived with a reprieve, commuting his capital sentence to hard labor in Siberia. He had already said goodbye to his life. That moment of looking into the abyss rewired him. He realized that the human spirit was not a mathematical equation to be solved by logic or radical theories. When you stare into the barrel of a gun, your theories about the world vanish, leaving only the raw, bare fact that you are alive and might not be in 10 seconds. Dostoevsky knew the exact temperature of fear, and he poured every degree of it into Raskolnikov's shaking hands. His 4 years in a Siberian fortress, living among the most hardened criminals, stripped away his youthful idealism. He observed that even in the most depraved perpetrators, there was a complex, irreducible soul that refused to fit neatly into formulas or labels. He saw the emerging fashion of believing in nothing, the rejection of all moral principles, as a poison that could dissolve a society from the inside. Crime and punishment was his first great counterattack against the idea that man could live by bread and brain power alone. He gave Raskolnikov his own physical ailments, specifically epilepsy, making the narrative feel like a continuous, feverish hallucination. The fever Raskolnikov suffers is the body's revolt against a mind trying to live without a moral compass. Dostoevsky understood that the true terror of a transgression is not the police at your door, but being trapped in a room with your own thoughts. The blood was on the floor, but the real punishment was taking shape in the form of a relentless, smiling investigator who knew how to let the one who committed the deed destroy himself. Mouse Game was about to begin, and Raskolnikov would quickly discover he was the mouse. The investigation of the slaying is where the story transforms into a high-stakes psychological duel. Enter Porfiry Petrovich, the magistrate who operates like a modern criminal profiler. Porfiry does not care about fingerprints or lab reports. He is a master of the human heart. He has read Raskolnikov's article about the extraordinary man and recognizes the student's soul as the true crime scene. Porfiry's interviews are psychological judo matches. He uses silence like a weapon, pretends to be confused, then suddenly lands on a point so sharp it nearly makes Raskolnikov faint. Porfiry knows that a man driven by a god complex will eventually feel the need to confess, not out of remorse, but to prove how smart he really is. That same itch drives people today to overshare online and brag about the very things that could destroy them. The tension between the two men is electric. The clash between a cold, isolated ego and the stubborn need for truth. Raskolnikov's very name comes from the Russian root for split, and the more Porfiry presses, the more the student fractures between the arrogant intellectual and the terrified human being. He is caught in a trap of his own making. The more he writhes, the tighter it gets. But Porfiry is not the only force closing in. From the depths of the Saint Petersburg slums, another kind of judgment is approaching, one that does not offer a cell, but a cross. As the walls close in, Raskolnikov finds himself drawn back to the scene of the act, almost as if the apartment itself were calling him home. He stands in the room where he spilled blood and feels, for a brief moment, a strange calm. Not the calm of a man who has gotten away with it, but the numb stillness of someone who is done running. He realizes that the extraordinary man was a costume he'd stitched for himself to hide his loneliness. He is not a Napoleon. He is a scared young man in a city that didn't care if he lived or ceased to exist. His brilliant theory reveals itself for what it is, an elaborate excuse to cut himself off from the rest of the world. The only road back is through an admission that he is just as ordinary as the people he used to look down on. If this analysis is helping you see Dostoevsky in a new light, please share this video with someone who loves classic literature or psychological thrillers, because now the story is about to do something even more unsettling. Introduce a character who can carry more suffering than Raskolnikov ever could and refuse to break. While Raskolnikov is being hunted by the law, he is also being pulled toward a different kind of judgment from the people in the slums. He meets Sonia Marmeladov, a young woman forced into a desperate life to prevent her family from starving. In the logic of Raskolnikov's theory, Sonia should be a louse, a person of no consequence. Yet, Dostoevsky makes her the spiritual center of the book. She is his anchor, carrying a burden he cannot even imagine, with a terrifying, quiet strength. When Raskolnikov finally confesses his transgression to her, he does so in a room lit by a single candle, as they read the story of Lazarus being raised from the state of no longer living. That candle, the only light in a world that has gone black, is the first thing he does not try to snuff out. Sonia does not excuse him. She does not rationalize what he did. She tells him to go to the crossroads, kiss the earth he has defiled, and proclaim to the world that he is one who has taken a life. Her message is brutal and simple. You cannot think your way out of guilt. You have to feel your way back to being human. In the shadows stands Svidrigailov, a man who has actually achieved the Napoleonic lack of conscience Raskolnikov fantasized about. He has crossed line after line and found nothing on the other side but boredom and a growing urge to take his own life. Svidrigailov is the mirror of what Raskolnikov will become if he never finds his soul, a well-dressed ghost walking through a world that no longer has meaning. The choice is clear and brutal. The path of Sonia, which leads through confession, humiliation, and Siberia, or the path of Svidrigailov, which leads to the cold end of a pistol. The road to the Siberian wilderness becomes the only way for the fever to break. After a grinding mental collapse, Raskolnikov finally follows Sonia's advice and confesses, earning 8 years of hard labor. The focus shifts from the suffocating grey streets of Saint Petersburg to the vast, harsh horizons of Siberia's riverbanks. Under that wide sky, the extraordinary man theory finally ceases to exist. Raskolnikov sees that his Napoleon complex was nothing but a disguise for isolation and pride. Through Sonia's unwavering presence beside him, he begins the slow, painful work of coming back to life. It is not a dramatic, glowing epiphany, but a long walk through the wreckage of his own past. Dostoevsky ends the book not with a neatly solved riddle, but with the first pages of a new story, a man trying to learn how to be human again. This is the hardest journey in the novel, because it demands the passing away of the ego before the birth of anything like a soul. He had to lose the world, his dreams of greatness, his illusions of superiority, to stand a chance of finding himself. And even then, a question hangs in the air like smoke. Can a man ever truly outrun the ghost of who he was? Or is resurrection just another story we tell ourselves to keep the darkness at bay? The final transition from the intellectual to the spiritual is not a lightning bolt. It is a slow grind. Raskolnikov sits on the banks of the Irtysh River, looking out at the nomadic tribes in the distance, and feels a connection he never felt with the intellectuals in Saint Petersburg. Their simplicity is not stupidity, it is strength. They do not write essays to justify their existence. They work, they love, they suffer, they continue. In that unadorned existence, Raskolnikov feels the first fragile sprouts of his own salvation. He understands that the extraordinary man he wanted to be was the one who was truly no longer living, and that the ordinary man sitting in the dirt is the one finally beginning to live. So what does this mean for us in a world that increasingly worships efficiency over empathy? Raskolnikov's tragedy is a mirror for any culture that believes it can solve the mystery of human existence with an algorithm or a spreadsheet. It reminds us that part of the human spirit will always rebel against being categorized, optimized, or used as a means to an end. We are more than the sum of our useful parts. When we forget that, we invite the axe into our own homes. You invite it into your own life every time you treat people, or yourself, as numbers instead of souls. We live in an age that tells you that you must be extraordinary to matter. Dostoevsky's answer is quietly, stubbornly different. The greatest achievement is simply being human. Crime and Punishment remains a masterpiece because it refuses to hand out easy answers or comfortable lies. Raskolnikov thought he was Napoleon. He ended as a man on his knees. But his story is not just a warning about taking a life. It's a warning about the lies we tell ourselves to justify our own darkness. We all have a garret in our minds where we brew theories about why we are better, smarter, or more necessary than the person next to us. Because the scariest part of this book isn't the axe, and it isn't the blood. It's the realization that given the right circumstances, the right amount of desperation, and the right intellectual lie, you might have picked it up too. The only real question is not whether Raskolnikov could put the axe down. It is whether you would ever put it down if you were the one holding it. Would you have the courage to find your way back, or would you simply let the shadows swallow you whole? The door is open, the axe is heavy, and the choice, as always, is yours. It is a choice we make every day, in the small moments of kindness or cruelty that define our own ordinary lives. Let us know in the comments below. Do you believe Raskolnikov was truly redeemed? Or was his confession just another form of surrender? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the dark and brilliant world of Fyodor Dostoevsky. If you want to understand why your own mind works the way it does, you have to look at the stories that dared to go into the basement of the human soul. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to join the elite few who actually understand the masterpieces that built our world. Don't forget to like the video and comment the axe below if you made it to the end. See you in the next chapter of history's greatest stories.